of God's word together. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master, and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me?" When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his flesh was restored, and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." The second passage we're going to look at comes from Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19. This is on page 741 of your pew. Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." Please pray. God, we thank you for your word. Thank you that in both the Old and the New Testaments you speak to us. And we thank you, Lord, for the opportunity we have to read your word, to reflect on it, and to be shaped by it. And so, God, we pray that you would give us eyes and ears, hearts and minds that are open to you. And that in everything that is said and everything that is heard, you would be glorified. It's in your Son's name we pray these things. Amen. From time to time, probably like a lot of you, I can tend to get a little bit overwhelmed at sort of the state of our world and the shape our culture is in, especially when it comes to how horribly people can treat one another sometimes. But no matter how bad my despair about human nature gets, I can be thankful that at least I don't work in the court system, because that's where you see some of the truly disheartening stories. I recently came across a story about a lawsuit from a few years ago that was recently settled. It was a lawsuit brought by two siblings, 21-year-old Stephen Minor and his 18-year-old sister Catherine. The defendant in the case was their mother, Kimberly Garrity. Now, while there are certainly unnecessary and frivolous lawsuits clogging up our legal dockets, I can also imagine any number of situations in which one family member might reasonably have a legitimate claim against another family member. This is not one of those cases. The basis for this suit, according to official court documents, was bad parenting. Now again, if what is being alleged in this suit is some sort of abuse, bodily or emotional harm inflicted by the mother against her children, then one could understand it. One could see why the Minor siblings felt compelled to demand $50,000 from their mother for the distress she had put them through. But this wasn't the case. Instead, as evidence of their claim that Miss Garrity was such a bad parent that she should pay them tens of thousands of dollars as a penalty, the Minors brought the following list of charges before the judge. On one occasion, the mother actually refused to buy the daughter the homecoming dress she had picked out. Then on another occasion, she failed to take the daughter to a car show she wanted to attend. When her son was in college, she didn't send him any care packages. And finally, I'm glad you're sitting down because this one will really disturb you. She once sent her son a birthday card in which she wrote the words, "Have a great day, love and hugs, Mom," and yet this birthday card did not have any cash in it. Thus, the siblings' lawyer argued, Miss Garrity's actions constituted something like maternal negligence. He claimed that the case should be treated no differently than a medical malpractice suit, and he asked the judge to give his clients the attention they deserved. And the judge did just that. He laughed the case out of his court, and he sent the Minors back to their mansion in the Chicago suburbs with their tails between their legs. Now, you probably have a few colorful personal descriptions of the kind of behavior exhibited by these two adult, and I use that term loosely, siblings. Some of these descriptions wouldn't be the sort of thing you'd utter in polite society, let alone in a church sanctuary. But the widely accepted term for what's going on here, of course, is entitlement. The sense that the world owes us something. The tendency to get irritated or even angry when we don't have the life we think we deserve. Over the past few years, there's been no shortage of ink spilled and hands wrung over the fact that entitlement, as a kind of cultural disease, has reached epidemic proportions. And it's become common to point to members of younger generations, like Stephen and Catherine Minor, as the prime carriers and spreaders of this condition. But I think it's important to acknowledge that all of us, whatever our age, whatever our race, whatever our social class, we can all see evidence of this pernicious and pervasive attitude in our lives. And as I was thinking this week about how some of these things can have an impact on our behavior, I was reminded of a bit that a stand-up comic did on the Conan O'Brien show a few years back. It was a little rant about entitlement. It's come to be titled, "Everything is Amazing and No One is Happy." And according to this comic, because we live in a world that has so much abundance and so many conveniences, we are guilty on a daily basis of simply taking things for granted, of forgetting how good we have it, of failing to be even the least bit thankful for the good things, small and large, that we routinely experience. So if our internet connection goes out or our cell phone takes a few seconds longer than expected, even though these inventions are innovations that people lived for thousands of years without, we act as though the slightest interruption is the most grievous burden. And even if we never brought a lawsuit against a family member for a failure to send care packages, we all know that for all of us, this can be destructive. This kind of entitlement can destroy our happiness and our relationships. And scariest of all, it can damage our spiritual growth and formation. I think that one of the reasons that these kinds of stories irritate or even enrage us, one of the reasons why we get so angry at the feelings of entitlement that we see on display in others, and why we're so ashamed when we see these feelings in ourselves, is because this kind of entitlement runs contrary to what God intended for us. We were created not for entitlement, but for thanksgiving. Last week, we talked a little bit about attentiveness, about a careful willingness to look at what is in front of us, to do the work that God has placed before us. even the mundane things. We saw this as an essential attitude of faith. Well, today I want to reflect a little bit on the fact that gratitude is also central to our life of faith and our relationship with God. And it's been this way since the beginning. When God provided a beautiful and abundant world for us to live in, full of every good thing to eat, full of fellowship with every living creature. Well, humanity decided that we were entitled to the one thing he designated off limits. And so we went for the fruit that was forbidden instead. And when sin entered the world, when sin endangered forever our relationship to God and to the world he created, then gratitude became all the more crucial. Giving thanks for what has been provided is necessary if we are to understand our proper place in the universe. It's important that we recognize that we are creatures. We are not the creator. And so, throughout the early traditions of God's people, Israel is continually exhorted to worship God in thankfulness and gratitude. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Psalm 136 says. And then that psalm narrates a virtual catalog of God's deeds of provision and protection for his people. Psalm 66, which we read from earlier, says something similar. It declares, "Come and hear, all you who fear God. Let me tell you what God has done for me." See, the Jews of the Old Testament very rightly believed that their gratitude was a key element of their identity as God's people. Whenever they gave thanks to God for what he had done, they were living into their story. They were living into the purposes for which God had created them. This idea persists in the New Testament, where Paul tells the Philippians, "Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." So entitlement, a lack of gratitude, failing to give thanks, these things are more than just rudeness. They're a violation of who we were intended to be. The stories that we read today, one from the Old Testament and the other from the New Testament, are stories of need. We all have situations in our life where we're in need. There are stories of people who are hurting. We also all know what that is like. But there are also stories that reveal some of the ways that feelings of entitlement can work their way into our lives, and how gratitude can transform us. In 2 Kings chapter 5, we're introduced to one of the more remarkable characters in the pages of Scripture, a man named Naaman. And in just a few short verses, we learn some things about Naaman that clue us into the kind of impressive guy that he is. He's a general in the Aramean army in what is modern-day Syria. He's the commander of a fighting force that in the 9th century BC was more or less wreaking havoc throughout the Middle East. He was favored by his king. He was respected by his soldiers. In short, Naaman was someone for whom so much was going right. His military prowess, his political acumen had gained for him a certain amount of privilege in the world in which he lived. But Naaman was also someone for whom one very bad thing was going wrong. He had leprosy. And leprosy didn't care about Naaman's position. Leprosy didn't respect Naaman's privilege. Leprosy was intent on wrecking Naaman's life, no matter how many battles he had won, no matter how many medals he had earned. And while Naaman, a man at the top of his game, a man at the peak of his profession, doesn't seem to have an answer for what has afflicted him, there's someone in his life who does. A slave girl, a Hebrew, captured by raiders in an attack on her village and brought to serve Naaman's wife. She's far from home, and frankly, she has every right to be bitter over what has happened to her. When she heard of Naaman's diagnosis, she was entitled to a little bit of happiness. What the Germans call Schadenfreude, which means taking pleasure in an enemy's downfall. But this young girl responds differently. Instead of reveling in her captor's pain, she sees him as one worthy of compassion, and she offers some advice. "I know a guy in Israel," she says, "a prophet who can help you." Now, if you've ever been sick, if you've ever struggled with the frustration that comes with trying to get appointments, trying to get in to see the right doctor. You know that when someone you know gives you a referral, when someone uses their connections to help you out, that's like gold. This is what this young woman, in a very unlikely way, offers to Naaman. A referral to a healing prophet coming from a Hebrew slave. So this is setting up, here in these early verses of 2 Kings chapter 5, this is setting up as a textbook example of how God's people can accomplish amazing things. But first, a little bit of entitlement manages to get in the way of God's miracle. Naaman goes to his king, who sends his favorite general to Israel loaded down with gifts. But tellingly, the king of Aram doesn't send him to Elisha, the prophet that Naaman's slave girl told him about. Instead, he sends Naaman to the king of Israel with a letter reading, "I am sending you my servant Naaman so that you may cure him of his leprosy." I love the way that letter is worded, "so that you may cure him of his leprosy." See, the king presumes that the best place to go to get things done is to the throne room of another king. This is the way the world works. Important people lean on other important people. They don't lower themselves to ask for help from the rabble, even when that rabble happens to be a prophet of God. The king of Aram seems to think that the king of Israel is Naaman's best bet. And in the way the king of Israel responds with a sort of childish tantrum, the author of 2 Kings demonstrates that despite the assumptions of these important people, they're barking up the wrong tree. Thankfully, Elisha intervenes. He tells the king to send Naaman his way. And when Naaman arrives at the house of Elisha, he pulls up to the prophet's simple doorway in his magnificent chariot, full of the bounty of the Aramean kingdom. Elisha responds in an unexpected way. He sends a messenger out with a simple command. "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and you'll be cleansed." Now, to say that Naaman is displeased with this turn of events would be a gross understatement. Naaman is enraged. He's completely indignant on so many levels. See, he was expecting the prophet to come out and meet him personally. He was expecting this great man of God to solemnly pronounce healing in a grand display of divine power. But what he gets instead is the instruction, delivered by a servant, to go take a bath. This is beneath a man of Naaman's position. Especially upsetting, Naaman indicates, is the suggestion that dipping in the Jordan will make him clean. If it were just about getting dunked in the river, he says, I could have stayed at home. We've got better rivers in Damascus, cleaner rivers, than anything this place has to offer. And with that, in a cloud of pride and stubbornness and, I think, entitlement, Naaman threatens to take his leprosy and his chariot laden with gifts and go back home. Leave it up to his servants to talk some sense into him, to challenge him, to encourage him to do this simple thing that the prophet has asked. After all, it's worth a try. You've come this far. And so Naaman is forced to set aside his snobbish self-importance and to do what Elisha had instructed. And when he does, he finds that he is healed. And not just healed, he is completely cleansed. We read that his skin becomes clean like that of a young boy. It's as though God sees his willingness to humble himself, and he pours out a blessing that goes above and beyond anything Naaman could possibly have hoped for. None of this is lost on Naaman. Earlier, he had traveled to the prophet's house as a man who was wanting something. Now he goes to stand before Elisha only to offer thanks, only to give praise to the God who has effected this amazing work. He offers gifts, which Elisha refuses. But I love how this encounter between the Aramean general and the Israelite prophet ends. It ends with Naaman asking for as much earth as 2 mules can carry, so that he can take it home and build an altar to God. Think of the irony here. This is the same man who thought that the waters of the Jordan were unfit for a man of his position. And now he can think of no more precious treasure than some buckets of Israelite dirt. This is what happens when we recognize what God has done for us. We're cleansed of our pretensions. We stand before God as people who can't stop saying thank you. And in this, Naaman kind of prefigures the grateful leper from Luke's story. The 1 out of 10 who came back after being healed by Jesus to throw himself at Jesus' feet and thank him. Like Naaman, the Aramean general, he was an outsider. He was a Samaritan leper, despised by the Jews for his ethnicity and feared by everyone because of his affliction. And as with Naaman, when this leper finds himself cleansed, none of that matters. All that matters is finding the one who made him whole and saying thank you. All that matters is offering his humble gratitude at the feet of the man who had restored him. Not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally. The one who had saved him, not just from a life of physical pain, but also from a life of isolation and bitterness. When Jesus says to this leper, "Your faith has made you well," I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that he's talking about much more than leprosy. In this moment of humility, of thanksgiving, of unvarnished gratitude, it becomes clear that this man has been restored from the inside out. It's easy to throw stones at the entitled and ungrateful. Whether we're talking about people who live on our street, whether we're talking about an Aramean general, whether we're talking about lepers who didn't turn back and offer their thanks. But I think it's important to acknowledge that all of us are guilty of ingratitude. We're guilty of ingratitude to people who have made a difference in our lives, to the communities and institutions that have made us who we are. And most of all, we're guilty of ingratitude to God. We might look at Naaman coming out of the Jordan. We might look at the leper healed with a word from Jesus, and we say, if something like that ever happened to us, we would never stop giving our thanks. We would never stop offering our praise to our Heavenly Father. But the reality is, we can't wait for some enormous, miraculous display in order to begin showing our gratitude. Because the God we serve is a God of perpetual miracles. The God we serve is a God whose very presence in our lives is one continual divine blessing. The writer Simon Tugwell says, "These stories of miracles seem remarkable, and they are, because they reveal God's power to heal and restore. But what about all the times that God restores us over and over again?" In Paul's letter to Timothy, which we read from earlier, Paul reminds his young protege that even if we are faithless, God remains faithful. See, this God doesn't just bless us every once in a while. So we shouldn't wait to say thank you. This God we serve is a God who continually sustains us. And when we can realize that, then the feelings of entitlement that might otherwise enslave us, the tendency to take things for granted, will fade away. Because like Naaman asking for his dirt, like the Samaritan leper falling at Jesus' feet, when we recognize the ways that God has worked to bring transformation and healing and restoration in our lives, then we can think of nothing we would rather do than worship Him. Nothing we would rather say than thank Him. Please pray. God, we thank you for these stories. People who in some ways are really different from us. A general in an ancient army. A leper sitting by the roadside. But in a lot of ways, Lord, these people are very much like us. They were hurting. They were in need. They experienced your healing power in their lives. And they were compelled to say thank you. God, we pray that we would learn from their example, because you have poured out your love on us in so many ways. Lord, we know that we struggle. We have difficulties in our lives. We have emotional difficulties, financial difficulties, family difficulties, health difficulties. We struggle with our faith, but Lord, we also know that you are faithful. Help us to be aware of that. Help us to continually not just say thank you with our words, but to live lives of gratitude, lives that point to what you have done, and lives that say to those around us, come, let me tell you how God has worked in my life. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus, that we pray these things. Amen.